Howdy all you delicious people, I'm here today to review The 13th Floor. So, this movie is to be broken down in a way of which that is to make a person realize that their entire life is to not be real. And what are they going to go on and do once they find that answer? Are they gonna become a killer? Are they gonna go and investigate what had happened to a person they are to befriend, and in the end possibly come up with some kind of answers themselves that eventually will hope to have them be rewarded with those answers? Or really is it all just gonna just break down and go into chaos and anarchy and whichever? But let me go and grab that popcorn and just see how this all plays out. So, really, in all honesty, the 13th Floor, if you just look at the title, you would think it'd be a horror film, but it's not. It's really just this noir, like, detective film that really is to span a couple of time periods. So, really, I thought that this movie was rather just flat and plain, but I really was to go on and enjoy it because this was to, of course, be yet another movie that I was to have seen in my youth randomly late at night at one point, and I never went on and fully immersed myself in the entire story, the entire tale, especially that ending, because man, it was kind of ironic that I was to go on by the end of the film and find out what the date was to be by the end of the movie. But so, really, when I'm gonna have to go on and have to compare this movie to other things, more than likely you're probably gonna go on and state that a lot of things I'm gonna compare this to would just be weaker by comparison, but I just feel that I have to go on and compare it to other things. Because of course, this movie would have to probably be compared to the Jude Law Existenz movie, where that's a very much video game-ish like world. Uh, really the Ryan Reynolds Free Guy movie, because it's fairly similar. It's a simulation. The Hugh Jackman Remnants film that probably is to be fairly hard to pronounce, so I'm not even sure I'm even saying that movie right. But Hugh Jackman is also in a kind of detective virtual world like thing at some point. And also the Matrix film with Keanu Reeves, and I think there's also one more in there somewhere. The Tobey Maguire Pleasantville movie. So we come to find a character named Douglas who is to eventually inherit this company, who is to have concocted this simulation into 1937. And eventually when he is to find that he is to have inherited this company from a man named Fuller, Douglas is to need to know why he has inherited this company from Fuller. And it seems that there is to be a mystery that Douglas is to solve within that. And plus also there is a suspicion that Douglas himself could have possibly killed Fuller. So now we really just have Douglas kind of running around not only his world that he is to be in, but then also is to go into this simulation and try to be asking all of these people if they can go on and give him any kind of answers to just kind of figure out who was to have gone on and been the one to have killed Fuller, or if he himself had gone on and killed Fuller himself and not even realize it. So we eventually have Douglas, who is to meet this girl named Jane Fuller, and eventually it seems that they have some kind of magnetism between the two of them. There's just this love at first sight thing kind of going on between the two of them. And then by the end of the tale, we start to realize like why Jane is just so infatuated with this man. And eventually that's where, like, really by the end of the film, I'm like, dude, like, this movie had to be carried really by one guy, and then you're making this guy kind of get weaker by the end, story wise, if you were to see the tale. But and it just kind of does ruin the ending a little bit, but really, like you still get a happy ending by the end of the tale. Like, you still get something that I feel is to ultimately be okay enough. It's a light okay, but at the end of the day, it's still a thumbs up film. And again, it's very flat, it's very weak, but you know what? Like, it's just interesting enough. Uh Really also, like, this movie did kind of feel like that Ethan Hawke Jude Law movie where Ethan Hawke was to go on and eventually like swap lives with Jude Law so that way he could become this astronaut, and whichever, like, because that's really also just kind of like a noir kind of movie also, that eventually has these detectives and trying to figure out this whole puzzle piece thing going on. But so anyways, and I believe it has a name of like Gattaca or Gattaca, something like that. If you look up Ethan Hawke Jude Law movie, I'm sure there's a very small amount of actual titles of whatever that would match that. But anyways, it also had Uma Thurman in it. So for those of you who are movie aficionados, you would go on and really understand what that film is. But so I think it's Gattaca. It's been a while since I've seen that film. But so with that said, yeah, like my mind wasn't blown with this film, or really, like, this was a movie that, like, I was like so hooked into the film that, like, watching it for an hour and 40 minutes like just didn't bother me. And also, it was is one of those where I finally needed to see the whole film from seeing it years ago as a kid, and just kind of curious about what this really was. So, with that said, I really think that I should probably just go on and just go into real legitimate spoilers and whatever have you, because there's really not much I can go in and fully uh like talk about this film other than the very much kind of straight forward approach that I've kind of already done. So with that said, I think it's about that time to just go into spoilers and the full cast list upon my phone. In all honesty, I'm not going at this with notes, even though I probably should have, because there's a lot to just chop away at when we get to full on spoilers. There might even be settings at some points that I might actually remember within this brain noggin, like the Lindy Hop contest, or the Wilshire Hotel, the Greyson's bookstore library. Not really sure what that was. I think it's a bookstore. That would make more rational sense in my brain. But anyways, let's go on and let's pause this review because it's spoiler time. Spoiler time is about that time I'm going to spoil this whole entire film. All right, spoilers. So, Douglas Hall is to be in a world. And then we also have the simulated 1937 world. And so I think whenever I'm going to have to kind of separate the two, I'm going to have to go on and probably call Douglas's World 1999, because that's when this film year was actually done. And then eventually, by towards the end of the film, we're going to have some 2024 action, which I thought was actually hilarious. But so, and also this movie had a really decent cast. Like, I think everyone who was kind of chosen for this cast, like, I think they really did fit the bill really well. But anyways, let's go into this tale. So we have this character, and there's going to be quite a few characters that are going to be held by a plethora of different names. So I'm going to try to figure out a way to least confuse people by what I'm going to end up kind of plopping out here. So, because we have Fuller, Hannon Fuller, who is to also be in the 1937 world as a person named Grierson. But for right now, I'm going to go on and just call him Fuller because that's who everyone goes on and names him as in the scenario. So, like, that's what I'm talking about here. So, we go into the Wilshire Grant Hotel, and Fuller has gotten from out of this bed and paid his lady of the night and is to be writing this letter to a man named Douglas Hall, going on and explaining that he is to be the only one who is going to truly be able to understand this, whatever this letter is to unfold. We never really get to see the lettering and the full uh, tale that is to be put upon this paper at all within this film. We get so close to it, but no cigar. So we have Fuller, who, after paying his lady and making his way out of this hotel, we would come to find that Fuller is to get into this checkered cab after going on and giving this letter to Ashton, which Ashton goes on and opens up and fully reads. So Fuller goes on and is to make his way home and is to kind of get ready for bed, sleep next to his wife, and then he is to wake up from out of this simulation. And so this is actually Fuller in 1999 instead of the early part of this movie where he was to, of course, been in 1937 with Ashton and sleeping with this girl, the lady of the night, in 1937. So, which is to be the other simulation. So, Fuller goes on is to have come out of this simulation, 1999, and is to make his way to this bar, going on and is to ask for this martini and is to want an olive out of it, which of course this bartender does not give him. It's like, oh, well, here's some pretzels. Like, you're gonna have to just get good enough here, buddy, instead of the 1937 equivalent of a nice glass with your martini within it, or your olive within the martini. So we would have Fuller that is to go on, and in 1999 we have characters who just kind of swipe these cards to just kind of pay for everything. So this is supposedly to be like 1939, but it's like a weird kind of futuristic 1999. So like the whole setting of it, but it is what it is. So we have Fuller here that goes on and makes this phone call, and he is to go on and call Douglas. And eventually Douglas is to go and get a answering machine call, which really tells us that this is to be 1999 because those things no longer exist. It's all off of a cell phone now. But so Fuller, it seems, is going to make this phone call, but then eventually gets pulled away from this phone call by eventually finding a guy outside of the bar that eventually stabs into him and kills him. So the next thing that we end up going on and seeing play out here is that Douglas Hall is to be waking up from his day in, of course, 1999. So I feel that I'll only kind of more state that when eventually we have time or simulation shifts, but like we'll get into that eventually. So Douglas Hall goes on to wake up for his day, is to kind of unusually find that his sink is to have some drips of blood upon it, and he is to notice that his shirt is very bloody and blooded. And so Douglas is to just be like, well, what the heck happened last night? I got into one of those other blackouts, and like I can't make up for certain amounts of time, which is 2 hours worth. So Douglas is to go on and check his answering machine. Again, this is some kind of future. You wouldn't be having real answering machines. But so Douglas is to come to find out when he is to kind of go through his answering machines and kind of fast forward through a lot of them. He finds that this detective agency is to want to have him come in for questioning. So Douglas, because of course, really just kind of like, oh no, like, what have I got myself into? I see the bloody shirt, the sink with blood on it. Like, I guess I should go on and just kind of see if there's anything I really need to answer to. So Douglas goes on and makes his way to this police station and meets with this detective, Larry McBain. And McBain ends up going on and is to tell Douglas, is like, well, hey, like, Hannon Fuller, yeah, he's dead. Like, I'm sorry. And has him come in to identify the body, and really doesn't seem that there is to be having Hall be like suspect number one here. And McBain is even to go on and just kind of ask Hall, it's like, well, like where were you the night before? It's like, well, I was at home. It's like, oh, okay, sure, all right, I'll buy that. So we have McBain that is to go on and ask Douglas. Is like, well, hey, like, I might still have some other questions for you. Like, would you mind if I kind of continue to go on with you throughout your day? Because also, like, McBain is going to have to go on and kind of question other people, like Jason Whitney, who is to also be kind of this more tech side of this film. We also had come up with his own simulated character called Jerry Ashton. So, who had gone on and read that letter from some time in the simulation, whatever, before. But so, we have Douglas, who is with McBain, making their way to Fuller's office to just kind of look over some things. And we would, of course, have McBain going on and having this office more so like come off as a home to him. And so he's like, well, yeah, like, I've seen those kind of billboards where it's like, man, like making your work a home or whatever it ends up really actually saying there. But like, he's really realizing like how like much money that these guys are probably have, to where like not only do they have an office, but like there's a whole room with a bed and everything. But so we have McBain and we have both Douglas making their way through Fuller's office. And so eventually that leads us to come to find that there is to be someone else in this office with them. And so Douglas is to go on and meet Jane Fuller, Hannon Fuller's daughter. So it's like, oh, okay, all right. So what exactly are you going on and doing here? Because maybe you are possibly going to inherit this company, but we come to find out that, oh no, Jane is not going to go on and inherit this company at all. Like, she goes on and like speaks to this lawyer who is to state, it's like, oh no, 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 like, you're not going to really get a cent out of this company. If anything, your father had left this whole thing to Douglas, which is to go on and eventually have McBain find Douglas to be even more of a suspicious culprit of this whole death of Fuller's, when eventually he goes on and says so while playing this little baseball game and trying to figure out if Douglas could have gone on and really have been the killer. But I think he's really profiling him and dissecting him, just be like, you know what, like, I think he's a good man. Like, I don't think he could really be the guy that I'm looking for. But so we have Douglas talking to Jane, and really, like, you can just tell there's some kind of chemistry between these two people. And so Douglas finds out that Jane is the daughter of Fuller, and that eventually Jane has kind of just been estranged to her father, to the point of Douglas having no real knowledge of Jane even existing. But we have to realize that this Jane character is to seemingly be speaking the truth. So on, of course, on McBain's way out, eventually he goes on to question Jason Whitney and try to much more kind of figure out like what this company is doing, because of course we would go on to have Douglas, who is to try and say that what they're kind of working on is very much like confidential and hush hush. But so McBain is to eventually find out from Whitney that they're kind of working on this kind of just simulated world. And so we have Douglas, who eventually is to connect with Whitney, and Whitney, of course, is just very distraught by Fuller's death and is to really just be questioning, like, why did he have to die in such a savage way? And really just kind of having an implication here that he may have definitely not gone on and been the killer by how he's kind of reacting to it. But so Douglas is to go on and ask Whitney, like, what has Fuller been up to? And Whitney would have to go on and tell him the truth. It's like, well, yeah, he has been jacking into the system, and he has been going on into the simulation and playing into it. And Douglas is to just be like, well, wait a minute, like, I didn't think that we were like testing anybody yet. I didn't think that that was possible yet. And Whitney would go on and tell him the contrary. It's like, oh no, no, like, yeah, like the old man like took a risk and like it paid off. So like, yeah, he's just been going into the simulation and playing with it, because like, who knows when his days could really be numbered. And ironically, that's how it all played out. So Douglas is to possibly realize that maybe anyone in the simulation could have a answer for him. a message for Douglas from Fuller, because Douglas would go on and realize that, of course, Fuller had called, and Douglas had gone through his message machine, and Fuller is to go on and state that it's like, well, yeah, like, I left you a message within the simulation, and then he ends up getting interrupted by the call, and Fuller is to then leave because he is to have met somebody that he thought he could trust. But so Douglas is to go through this computer and try to figure out if there's any messages from Fuller himself that was to be left to Douglas. So he's going through this computer when he's like, well, hey, like, maybe it was through the simulation because Fuller had been in that simulation. So a lot of stuff I have to break down, and I'm sorry if this is very much confusing. My bad. I'm not great at breaking things down when especially it comes to something like this, because there's a lot of tech side at certain points of this film. But anyways, so Douglas decides, like, okay, well, I'm going to be spending 2 hours in this simulation, and Whitney's like, no, 60 minutes is more than good enough. And Douglas is kind of refusing. It's like, no, 2 hours exactly. And Whitney has to go on and give in to Douglas's wishes. So the simulation is running. So Douglas goes into this world and is to be John Ferguson. So John Ferguson, we find, is this bank teller, and so really I'm not going to go on and state that Douglas is to be this John Ferguson character. I'm just going to state that he's Douglas within 1937 is how I'm going to just kind of play this all out. So kind of bear with me here. So Douglas is to be this bank teller that eventually leaves his post by having his bank teller thing being called closed after giving this woman her money. So we have Douglas leaving his stand, and we would have this this bank manager who goes on to look at Douglas, who is kind of running his hands through the sink and looking at his kind of newly mustached and hairstyled body. And the bank manager is to go on and say, like, well, hey, man, like, maybe you should take a 30-minute break. And we would go on and find Douglas, who's still like, yeah, I'm going to be leaving a lot more than that on the table here. So Douglas goes on to leave because we find that this simulation taking place in 1937, like, people would have to go on and live a person's entire life, but only for 2 hours. So really, if you would go on and have any weird, strange, like, time things kind of going on here, like, how do you go on and do an investigation while also having to, like, be in the grocery store getting a milk and cookies for your wife or loved one or family or whoever? But so regardless of that, let's move on here. So Douglas is to do this investigation that is to lead him to needing to figure out where Fuller had gone to. So Douglas is to first go on to the Grierson's bookstore to meet with Grierson, who is to be Fuller's doppelganger. So Douglas is to go on and speak with Grierson, and is to ask him, it's like, well, hey, like, you wouldn't by chance know a Hanan Fuller, would you? Like, he's to have been a guy that invented this microchip and is to be this kind of very like successful man and so on and so forth, and is to have written this book in 1870 and this and that. And we would go on to have Grierson, who's like, no, like, name doesn't sound quite all that familiar to me. And Douglas is like, well, okay, like, well, like, thanks for your trouble. And Douglas just has to kind of go on and just kind of walk off here. But so eventually this goes on to have him meet a girl named Bridget, who he has to go on and just kind of put the pieces together that Fuller had decided to go on and kind of bed all of these numbers of different women within the simulation, as Douglas is to go on and make his way to this kind of just cleaning station and be looking for Bridget, but Bridget is to, of course, be at this Wilshire hotel. So Douglas makes his way to the Wilshire hotel to try and get the attention of this dancer known as Bridget. And we would come to find Bridget, who is just fairly busy with this whole dance practice, to just be like, hey, how about you turn to this Ashton character? And so when Douglas goes on and realizes that like his 2 hours are almost up here, we have Douglas, who is in face to face with Ashton, who he realizes looks just like Whitney. Is like, oh my god, like spitting image. Shorter hair, but still Whitney. Look-alike. And Whitney goes on and divulges, like, well, hey, did you like my simulation character that looks just like me? It's like, yeah, like, maybe a bit too much like you. So Douglas goes on and starts speaking to Ashton, and he starts to become ill. Like, there all of a sudden is to be this kind of fuzziness that is to go into this character's voice, to where it's kind of a little bit harder to make out. And Douglas is to start to feel sick, to the point of him rushing to the bathroom to almost hurl his milk and cookies. So we come to, by that point, to have Whitney needing to pull Douglas out, because the transformation between John Fergus's brain and Douglas Hall's brain is almost complete, to where we would have to assume if a character had spent way too much time in that simulation, like, they could die. Like, it's almost kind of like that James Franco, like, JFK movie, where eventually James Franco, like, goes through this one, like, door or whatever that takes him back to a different time, where the whole JFK assassination is kind of going on, and James Franco is trying to figure out who had gone on, well, who is to be the person to kill JFK, so that way he could stop him, and so on and so forth. So, oops. So, anyways, we would have Douglas, who is to be coming out of this simulation, and is to just be like, okay, like, well, I didn't clearly get to any answers, but finding out that within this simulation that Fuller had just been kind of loose with the ladies. And so really it's like, well, okay, like, that's understandable to really to think about that. If you're gonna have a simulation, like, you might as well just if you're gonna have 2 hours in a life, in another person's life, like, I guess, like, that would be one thing that you could go on and do. And so Douglas is to go on and find out that he is to be an inheritor of this company. And we have McBain kind of having him be much more of having him realize that Douglas is to have a motive here to want to off Fuller, but, like, really Hall isn't exactly showing his hand, because he really doesn't know. Like, he's not really sure. There had been some time lapse within the night of a death. There had been bloody clothes, so Douglas could maybe suspect himself of killing said Fuller, but he's not sure. So Douglas is to eventually go on to finding a character named Tom Jones, who is to kind of state that he is to have a name quite like the singer. And Tom Jones is to eventually hold up Douglas Hall for a big payday. And is to state that Fuller and Hull had been outside this bar, so we'd have to possibly go to the conclusion that Douglas might have been this killer, and this now Tom Jones character is to be holding up for money. But it seems that Tom Jones is eventually going to meet another fate besides a payday, which is to really just have him eventually just check out. Because Douglas is to go on and put his head through this window, and Tom Jones is to disappear. But then eventually, we would come to find after Douglas is to try and meet up again with Jane Fuller, and is to eventually be very honest with her and divulge that, well, yeah, like, this guy is after me. Like, it seems that he is blackmailing me, and like, I don't really know what to do here. Like, I don't even know if I had gone on to kill this guy, and I don't think I did. And like, I don't think I could be that kind of person, and so on and so forth. So amidst Douglas probably realizing that this is his maybe last day that he's probably going to ever live in this world freely, we have both Douglas and Jane just kind of dancing it out between the two of them. And Douglas and Jane are to have this very much deja vu-ish like moment. And Jane is to go on and say, it's like, well, you know what? Like, probably the reason for this deja vu like moment is to really just say that between the two of us, there's very much a love at first sight thing going on here. And we have this kind of weird, like, smudging thing that Douglas is kind of doing with Jane's face, where he's kind of going all over her face with his face and almost doing like an Eskimo kiss kind of thing. But it's just very just weird what he's doing there. But I get it. Like, they're having some kind of close, passionate moment without actually kissing. But it just comes off as him just kind of just rubbing all over her face, and it just looks weird. But so Douglas and Jane eventually are to seemingly have this eventual passionate moment in bed, so on and so forth, in this film somewhere. But so Douglas is to go on and make his way home to eventually be hauled in by the police, by McBain. And so we have Douglas within this prison cell, and he is to all of a sudden be freed. And Douglas is just like, oh, why? Like, how? And we would come to find that Jane is there just kind of signing away the bail of Douglas, and is to have also come up with Douglas's alibi of, oh yeah, I told him that you and me were to have spent the whole night together, as well as also having McBain throw pictures to Douglas of the death of Tom Jones. Well, Tom Jones, of course, could not have been killed by Douglas because Douglas was with Jane at that time. So we have Douglas that is going on and wanting to figure out this whole mystery, this whole tale. And so Douglas is to, of course, go on and make his way back into 1937. And instead of him being manned by Whitney, he is to decide to just kind of man this all himself, but he doesn't go on and set the 2-hour timer for him to come back out of the simulation. So Douglas goes on to speak to Grierson again, and Douglas is to be banging on the Grierson bookstore, is to be desperate to get this guy to come out. And we would have Grierson, who's at this just kind of side window, just like, hey, what are you doing? It's late out. What the heck do you want me for? And Douglas is to go on and state, it's like, well, hey, like I know why you're losing time. Like, I can explain this to you. And, like, do you ever have times when you have these deja vu-ish, like, moments? And Grierson is just like, you got me there. So, eventually, we have Grierson who goes on to explain that, yeah, it feels like there are certain times where, yeah, I am losing time, and also I am starting to much more realize that I am coming home between these time lapses with women's perfume upon my wardrobe. And we have a point where Grierson is to have found out this outfit that he is to just kind of be baffled by, but again is to kind of have the same similar kind of colognes and perfumes and whichever of. And so Grierson is like, well, this outfit must somehow have connections with my lapse of time. And then also, like, Grierson has probably been really had his wife upset with him because of these possible affairs that he has no real memory of. So we would have Grierson, who is now coming into the Wilshire Hotel as Fuller. But he's not Fuller because Fuller is technically dead. But so everyone in this place is to call him Fuller, but he's still Grierson. So a little bit of confusion here, but we'll get to the point. So Douglas is trying to jog Grierson's memory of maybe what he had possibly been dreaming of, what Fuller had gone on and done within this simulated reality. And so Grierson is to start to realize that when people are to welcome him to this Wilshire Hotel, he's like, well, yeah, like, I remember that girl, Bridget. I remember this girl there. And I remember, I remember Ashton, the bartender who I'd given this message to. So Douglas, who was like, aha, like, I went on and I spoke to him earlier, and he had never mentioned anything about Fuller beyond him knowing what drink he was to have and how he was kind of loose with the ladies, and nothing at all about some message. So, like, there's got to be something about this Ashton guy that's got to be sus. So Douglas makes his way to meeting up with Ashton, who has disappeared behind the bar, to have Douglas try to go in the back ways of this hotel to find Ashton, who is to go on and eventually reveal to Douglas what that letter had gone on and stated. That this whole world that Ashton has been in is to have just been a simulation. And Ashton is to go on and state, it's like, well, like, I didn't believe this man at first. I thought it was all crazy talk. But then, you know what? I decided that I would just start to just drive, endlessly drive to a place that I would never go on and think of to ever really drive to. And I broke beyond these barriers, and I found out that the world that I had come to know was eventually not complete, was eventually to just be this kind of grid-like thing that we're kind of seeing here. Almost fairly similar to the Jim Carrey, like, Truman Show, where eventually we find Jim Carrey's character going on to this boat and eventually going further and further on this watery journey to find that the skies that he had seen off in the distance really just painted on to some wall that eventually had some door that he could walk and exit out of. But so we would come to find that Ashton is to realize that his world is to just be this simulation, and he is to now be holding a gun against Douglas, and Douglas is to desperately want Ashton to give him that message so he can read it word for word, letter for letter, even though Ashton had possibly gone on to tell him technically what the letter said. And so Douglas and Ashton, it seems, are to eventually start to wrestle for this letter. And eventually that leads them into this pool area where we would come to find Ashton using this letter as a way to get away from Douglas, but then eventually leading them into this pool where Ashton is drowning Douglas, forcing Douglas to wake up from this simulation to now be John Ferguson. And that is to go on and confuse Ashton yet again at prior time when Douglas Hall had gone on to be in the simulation the first time and said, hey buddy, after leaving the bathroom, and now being John Ferguson, Ferguson like says to like Ashton, it's like, well, hey, yeah, my name is John Ferguson. Like where am I? And Ashton is just like, huh? Like, okay, all right, whatever, buddy. But so now that we have John Ferguson coming back again, we have Ashton who is just starting to put the pieces even better back together now. So, anyways, so Douglas is going on and wrestling with who he thinks is Ashton, but is actually to be Whitney because they look the same, but long hair. And so Douglas accidentally hits Whitney, and Whitney is to go on and be like, what the heck is going on? Like, what were you doing in that simulation? You almost took my head off. You punched me. And so Douglas is to have to go on and have some explaining to do, and then realize, like, well, yeah, like there's really just like a lot just kind of going on right now, that Ashton has gone on to like figure out that this is all a simulation. Maybe he could have even gone on and killed Fuller somehow or another. And so we would have Douglas, who is to go on and come to the conclusion that he now needs to go back and find Jane again and talk to her. Because we, at some point, would go on to find that that McBain will come to the same answer too. But Fuller never really and truly had a daughter. Like, it's not so easy to just find this girl. And so here is where the chase starts to continue here. So maybe alluding to some suspicions that Jane might have actually been the killer of all of this. So Douglas goes on to find that Jane is to have actually been a girl named Natasha uh, Molinaro, and that has Douglas going to this one address to come to find that, like, okay, this girl isn't going by the name Jane Fuller. Instead, her name is really Natasha. So Douglas goes to this grocery store and is to check out with all these items, is to meet with Natasha, who looks drastically different than the actual Jane character. And so Douglas is to put the pieces together of, like, oh, so Jane is to not be real here because the Natasha character is to be this world's simulation. It's like, oh, just Inception kind of going on here. So Douglas is to go on and is to check out with his items and then throw them all in the garbage. But then Natasha runs back and is to give him this credit card. And Natasha is to go on and talk to Douglas and just be like, well, you know what? Like, there's something just deja vu about you and I together. And Douglas is like, well, yeah, of course it is, because like I slept with you. I did the deed. I know you all up and down. No, like, Douglas doesn't admit to that, but it's like, well, yeah, like, there is just something about you that does look very familiar, because Douglas just kept looking at her up and down by this register. And Natasha is like, well, hey, you want to take a picture? It'll last longer. And the guy's like, oh, I'm sorry. Like, there's something just familiar about you, but I know why it's so familiar. So Douglas is to go on and he is to drive as far as he can for as long as he can, to come to find out that his world too is entirely a simulation. And so that brings all of a sudden a phone call coming from Jane to Douglas, and that forces Douglas to then realize, like, yes, like, his world is a simulation. There are thousands of worlds that are to be simulations. And we could come to that conclusion that maybe none of these worlds are really to at all be real. And, like, that is the future of it all. But so, in a weird kind of a turn of events. But so, but that's not exactly like the way this all ends, with like the every single world being a simulation, but there's thousands of them. So how do you know what is real by the end of all of this? But so, anyways, Douglas goes on, meets with Jane, and they have this passionate moment between the two of them, because Jane is to really love Douglas. And eventually we find out that there is to be another guy that looks just like Douglas in her world, that was to be kind of like the earlier version of who we eventually find out will be David as Douglas. But so, anyways, so after Jane is to go on and bed Douglas, we would come to find that Douglas ends up getting a phone call, because Whitney had gone on and decided to go into this simulation and be Ashton, who is kind of just driving wildly and not realizing like where he is, because this is Whitney as Ashton now. So we would come to find that Whitney ends up crashing this car, and is to eventually have this cop car kind of pull him over. So we have, of course, the kind of cliche-ish, like, hey, like, nice driving, like, have you been drinking tonight kind of thing. And we have Whitney who's coming to the conclusion, it's like, oh no, I ended up just kind of swerving out of the road of something in the road there, and I'm sorry. Just so the cop is just like, okay, well, give me your license and registration like usual, and all of a sudden there is to be this knocking at the uh, trunk of this car. So that, of course, has the police officer just being like, hey, open up this trunk. And of course, Whitney does, and then that accidentally leads him into walking right in front of this bus, which he collides into, and that leaves Ashton to become Whitney in 1999. So, because, like, really, when you kill off Whitney, who is in 1937, like, the only thing really left to do is have that brain eventually completely all get swapped into what is left in the 1999 world. So Ashton is now being 1999, and so he goes and walking around into this facility, and he doesn't understand how the doors work. And so he's just trying to open this glass door, and he realizes that the card swipes the door open. So he's trying to figure this out, and we have this security officer who's like looking, like, is this guy drunk? What's going on here? So the security guard calls up Douglas. It's like, well, hey, like, Whitney is acting really weird, but Whitney is actually Ashton here, so yeah, it's a lot weirder than we thought. So Douglas is like, okay, like, I'll, like, I guess Whitney went on and he went into the simulation, so yeah, like let's figure out all how this is all gonna play out. So Douglas makes his way to the company, the facility, and we come to find Ashton, who is watching all these television like things, and is to try and much more understand Douglas's world. And Douglas is to want to break it to Ashton here. It's like, well, like, my world is basically just the same as yours. Like, I hate to break it to you, but like, I'm just as much an equal to you as you are to me. Like, I thought that you were a ant that I can just crush one day, but then I figured out that, like, I am an ant to your ant, and we are the same. Like, they don't actually get to that point in this film, but I'm just kind of poetically trying to ram this all out here. So, like, it's like the enemy to my enemy is my friend kind of thing. Like, the ant to his ant is a bigger ant. So we go on to have Ashton, who is to immediately want to go on and just be like, well, like, I want to see it. Like, I want to see, like, how my world looks to you. Like, I want to see it all. And so when both Douglas and Ashton are to go into this area that is to be this simulated area, we would come to find that through this elevator, we have Douglas become David with the whole kind of flashing of the eyes. So Ashton kind of is to become more loose and is to just kind of push his way into just kind of feeling all of these items, and is to talk about how like these machines are just kind of breathing. And eventually Douglas, or in this case really just David is to go on and say to Ashton, it's like, well, yeah, like these machines are breathing and you are going to be spending your last breath right here and now, as I'm going to shoot you and kill you now. So David then makes his way to Jane and is to, of course, want to go on and play around with her. Probably kill her off here so he can go on and get away with murder in this world to go back to his and just kind of get away of all of this scot-free, because he used to have killed a person in a reality world, and so it's not all the same, or a simulation, so to speak. So Dave is to go on and is to grab and uh choke Jane here, having then Jane realize, oh, this isn't the man of Douglas that I thought I loved, but eventually is to be David, who I had grown to hate, who was to have been my real true lover at one point in the early on stages, but really is to be a man that I had grown much more suspicions of, had gone on to kill my simulated father, who is to have been Fuller. I say simulated father because we really go on to find out that Jane is to reveal to Douglas her real world at the end of this film. So Jane tries to go on and get away from David to eventually have David be wielding a gun against Jane. And so, since we are to go on and have finally someone else besides Douglas and David and Jane to really come up with all the answers in this reality, we then have that person go on and shoot David and take him down. And so, really, there is to be quite a possibility, since there are thousands of different kind of worlds here, and Douglas was almost to be the man to shut the 1937 world down. We would come to have McBain, who has shot down Davis, or David, my bad, David, my bad. So McBain comes in to Jane, knowing all the answers and all the real truths here, and is to say to Jane, it's like, well, hey, like, since like I want to continue living in my world, like, how about once you go back to the world that you really and truly live in? It's like, how about you and everybody that is to kind of work behind the scenes here? How about you all forget about my world so I can keep on living my life? And so Jane is like, oh, okay, I'll go in and I'll do that. I'll do so. So Jane goes on and leaves this world, and we come to Douglas waking up and taking these simulated head pieces off of his head, and he is to kind of look through this area that is fairly unfamiliar to him, and he is to go on and realize that this is 2024. He's like, all right, okay, like somehow I made it out of all this alive, unscathed, and whatever. And so Douglas is to come to find out from Jane that this is to be her legitimate world, and a man who is to very much look like Fuller is to be off in the distance kind of living his beach life and having fun. And Jane is to go on and have to explain to Douglas, it's like, oh yeah, like the Grierson and the Fuller character, like they're all uh, like taken from the visuals of my dad. And like we had gone on and created this whole simulation of this world. And Douglas is like, oh, okay, all right, well, like, so this is to all eventually lead to like us just kind of having this like real explanation and understanding, and eventually this movie just kind of ends. So with that said, I am gonna just kind of roll out of here. So I feel somewhat that I got to most of this film, but not every little gritty piece of it, every smooth transition. Eventually, it got to the point where I was like, but I feel like I got to the nitty gritty in this film. Plus, also, I didn't want to spend an hour and 40 minutes talking about it just because of how probably not as important it is to probably other things comparatively. So, that maybe no one would probably care about this video at all. So, with that said, I'm going to go on and get the heck out of here. Hopefully, you guys have a great day, and I'm going to call it a day, hopefully, because I'm a little bit tired, but maybe I can just kind of squeak out another review. Who knows? I don't know. I don't know. Probably more likely this will probably be it. But anyways, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.